Just give us the perspective from your generation.
Well, not only am I a priced out buyer, Liam, but I also grew up as a young carer. So there is absolutely nobody that wants to see social care properly funded more than I do. But there is just no way that it's fair to ask young people to give up more of their income to protect the housing wealth of older people, when young people know that a lot of us are never going to buy a home. Resolution Foundation research suggests that a third of millennials will be renting from the cradle to the grave. 60% of private renters have absolutely no savings whatsoever. You know, there are not 250,000 households a year ready, willing and able to buy homes at current unaffordable prices. We're not going to be able to fix this crisis by relying on unaffordable market homes. We're not going to be able to fix this crisis through measures like Help to Buy, which just get a few more households into home ownership while boosting prices and making things less affordable for the next lot of renters that come along. We're going to need to do something different. And there is one tried and tested method that we know works for this problem, and that is building social housing. We build homes at prices that we know people can afford, at rents that we know allow people to save, with good quality, at a decent standard. We fix the housing crisis that way. And that means that working people can start their lives saving up some money. They can then go on to buy a home when they're ready, or if they prefer, they can enjoy the long-term security of a low rent and a secure tenancy. That's how we've done it in the past. That's how we can do it again. In the 1970s, there was no housing shortage. We had cracked it because multiple governments of both stripes had built enough housing. And they did that by building lots and lots of social housing because it's free from market forces.
Council housing, some people call it, or housing associations providing subsidised rented accommodation for low-income households.
Absolutely. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't rely on mortgage demand. It doesn't rely on people having enough savings. It relies on government borrowing at historically low interest rates and providing the homes that we know that people need. And the really beautiful thing about it, from a Conservative government's point of view, is that you can build millions of social homes and it will do barely anything to market prices. So given that this government is really concerned to protect house prices, and that's understandable because that is, you know, that's people's pensions, that's people's social care fund, that's people's wealth.
Voters' Wonga.
Absolutely. If we're not willing to take action to bring down house prices, then the least we can do, the only thing we can do indeed, is to build homes with price controls pegged to local incomes that people can actually afford. OK, let's turn to Ray Boulger before we go to Bob Seeley for a view from Westminster. Ray, there's three, if I may say so, old geezers in this debate today, and there's one young woman representing her generation. You have huge experience in the British housing market. You've watched the market for many, many years. We've just seen figures from the Halifax showing another record high. I mean, the reality is that house prices, they are going to keep going up, aren't they? They are going to continue to become increasingly unaffordable for, frankly, people like Rose.
It is the disconnect we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years between rental levels and mortgage interest rates. And the most important reason why house prices have gone up so much over the last 20 or 30 years is the steady reduction in interest rates. So you've now got a situation where it is actually much cheaper to buy a property than to rent, providing you can find a deposit. So for those people who are renting, one solution which would help them would be if we brought back 100% mortgages. Now, I know some people will say, you know, that's not a good idea, but the basic point about a mortgage is, can you afford it? And whether you borrow 95 or 100% is less important than whether it's affordable. So if you can demonstrate you can afford rent, it's very obvious that you can actually afford the mortgage payments as well. So that's one solution. Yeah. But I think because interest rates are such a critical part of this factor, and the biggest risk to house prices is that we see a sharp rise in interest rates. And that clearly doesn't look likely in the short term, but I would highlight that as being the biggest risk.
OK, let's just go back to the fundamentals before I bring you in, Bob. I've got a couple of graphics here, because the reality is, I cited the figures roughly in my opening. Let's look at them in more detail. If you look at house building over recent decades, you can see that in the last time we were building 250,000 homes a year was back in the 1970s. There 2.5 million in the decade as a whole, and since then house building has absolutely plummeted. And if we can go to the next graphic, that's house ownership by age. you can see again that those crucial 16 to 24-year-olds, God, remember when 16, 17, 18-year-olds used to own property, the 25 to 34-year-olds there, the crucial family-forming age from over 60% home ownership in 1991 down to just 40%. And they're the latest numbers I can get hold of, and I'm pretty good at this data mining stuff. But even in 2016 numbers, you can see a big fall there to under 40% now. Let's bring you in, Bob Seeley. You're a very thoughtful chap on this issue, if I may say so. You and I have debated housing over the years in many forums. You are a constituency MP, of course, on the Isle of Wight. And I know you're not against more house building, but you're against more house building in the wrong places, right?
I mean, yes, it's complicated. So just to sum up, I actually agree with a great deal that Rose said. If I could block these sort of selfish, this type of developer that just develops car-dependent, low-density, greenfield developments, which kill our tourism economy and turn the Isle of Wight into an adult social care economy, I would do that. If I could do anything to get more social housing, more council housing built on the modest amounts of brownfield sites in town centres like Newport, which is really struggling at the moment, I would. Because what I'm fed up with is for 50 years, we have increased our population by 50%, but it is dominated by a cash buyer market from the mainland, who very often retire to the island, fair enough, but we lose all our young people. So we export people like Rose, because for 50 years, for half a century, we have built the wrong type of housing, because we have allowed ourselves to be dominated by a mainland market rather than just saying, let's look after our young people. And it just grips me, this issue. There's lots of other complex issues around that, but I have a lot of sympathy with what Rose says.
So how do we get more homes built, Bob? I mean,
but you give
so many MPs, not you, I know, but so many MPs. The advice they're given is if it's planning related, you're against it. That's like a kind of survival guide to remaining in the House of Commons.
Well, I mean, for almost all greenfield sites, I will oppose on principle, because they're not built for young islanders, and they're not really built for islanders either, because they're car dependent. They're on greenfield sites. They damage us in lots of different ways. If the government there are three principles here that the planning bill should have. Well, I fear it's just going to be more of the same developer-led stuff, which Rose very eloquently opposes. But if we can get a plan, a local input, so a community-led, if we can make it environmentally sustainable, because we all know that detached houses are the most climate change unfriendly, most unsustainable form of housing, and they're car dependent. And if we can get it levelling up, lads, if the government is big about creating jobs up north, you're not going to have the drain of people moving from city to suburb and from north to south that has marked the last half century. We've increased population on the island by 50%. Liverpool, it's declined, not relatively, absolutely, by 30%. And in Blackpool and Hull and Birmingham and Manchester and about between half a dozen and a dozen great northern cities, you've had an absolute decline in population, and we need to re-energise other parts of the UK and drive housing there so it is really much cheaper. So actually it's an attraction not to head south but to head north. And places like the island, and clearly I'm speaking selfishly as a constituency MP, we need to have the right to look after our own. One final point, Liam, and then I'll be quiet. In the next 15 years, our own population on the island is actually due to decline by about 10,000, give or take. So actually, we don't need more housing. Clearly, we're going to build some. But actually, what we need is to be able to look after young people and build in our town centres, to revive our town centres in much more modest numbers than the government wants. Government says we want you to build 600, 700 a year. We have historically built on average 300 a year.
Let's try and squeeze in another contribution from each of you. I just want to bring up a graph that I've called phantom homes, and what this shows is the increase we've seen in planning permissions granted, residential planning permissions per year over recent years. There's lots and lots of planning permissions around, isn't there, Rose? Many of them aren't being used. I would say that's because big developers are sitting on them and not building the homes. Yep. There's a contrived shortage to keep prices high. Briefly, do you buy that?
I absolutely buy that. House builders build homes as fast as they can sell them for current prices. That is locked in by the land system that we've got, because house builders buy land, they compete for land by paying as much as they can for it based on current property prices. That is why private house builders are never going to build so many homes that prices come down.
Yep.
All the planning reform in the world isn't going to change that. What we need to do is create affordable sources of land for affordable housing, above all for social housing. Public land would be one great source of that. I know that that's something that Bob Seeley has been really active on in the past.
Thank you for that, Rose. And briefly, Ray, if I may, you're sitting there as the wise man. You've seen all this before. You've seen many ebbs and flows. What's one policy that you think should happen, briefly, Ray, in order to help people like Rose?
Well, if the government was ever going to borrow money to build houses cheaply, now is absolutely the right time to do it. The government can borrow money at about 1% long term. So that will be much cheaper for the government to provide subsidised housing than actually paying landlords housing benefits. So definitely the government should do that. The other point quickly I think is worth making is that we have a real social divide at the moment. Those first-time buyers who've got help from family and friends can actually afford to put down a big deposit. And that's a trend which, if nothing is done, is just going to continue, and it's going to get worse and worse for the people who can't afford to have family help, who don't have family help.
The good old banker mum and dad for those that have it. And Bob, just a political, worldly wise word from you from Westminster. This social debate, social care debate is raging in the Commons as we speak. We're going to come back to it after on the money. But these two issues really are interlinked, aren't they? Social care provision and home ownership, briefly.
Yeah, up to a point, they are. But I mean, we need to focus on what's important here. And Rose hit it on the head. There are 1 million outstanding permissions on the Isle of Wight, over 2,500, for example. And yet the Isle of Wight Council gets clobbered and criticised by government if we give permissions that then get land banked. We get the blame, and developers can then raid our green fields because they're sitting on the permissions rather than building them. So it's an unfair system, which is way too developer friendly and does not force developers to build the houses they've got permission to build. And I'm really hoping that a series of amendments that's going to come in the planning bill, looking at that will be one of them.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.